Good afternoon, and welcome to this Jamlab Meetup, a 4-part Jam Cafe monthly event series brought to you by the Civic Tech Innovation Network and us here at Jamlab. My name is Tapo Chabalala, and I head up the Jamlab program here at Viz Journalism. Joining me today, we have Kathy Magrobi, founder of Quote This Woman in South Africa. We've got Pinno, co-founder of Digital Woman Uganda. We've got Dr. Caroline Khene, senior lecturer at the Monfort University in the United Kingdom. And finally, we have Daniel Odongo, who is the director of implementation at Ushahidi, I think based in Kenya. So before we jump into today's topic of discussion, I want to do a bit of housekeeping. If you can, please do share and tweet today's conversation on social media using the hashtag Jamlab Meetup. And we really want this to be a discussion, a conversation, and would like you to please use the Q&A function for any questions directed to our speakers that you can see at the bottom of your screen, and also use for all the comments and queries, please use the chat function to your right of your screen. And so just so you're aware, this meetup is being recorded and will be publicly available on all various digital platforms in different formats. So for today's conversation, I'd like us to discuss and unpack the roles and strategies for promoting democracy and development during the upcoming elections across Africa. We all know that elections are vehicles which provide the basis for development and service delivery closest to where people live. And you would know that there are about 13 national elections and other municipal and local government elections taking place across the continent this year. But a lot of attention or eyes are looking at the elections in Zambia and Ethiopia. And we know that the general elections in the Horn of Africa were supposed to have been held last year in August, but were delayed, supposedly due to COVID-19 pandemic and restrictions. Early this month, we learned from the National Electoral Board of Ethiopia that they postponed the voting once again from June 5th to apparently no more than 3 weeks later. So we'll see what happens in the next couple of weeks and whether those elections do take place in June. We know that as well that there has been conflict in the northern parts of Ethiopia, and we understand from various media reports that voting in some areas will not take place during the elections. And exactly that's amongst one of the issues that I'd like us to chat about today. What is the role of journalism and civic tech communities during a time like this and during elections? And today I want us to touch or center our conversation around 3 interlinking themes. The first being on how do we bring in marginalized and other voices to the fore? How do we amplify those voices? A link to that is accountability. How do we hold government and political leaders accountable? How should journalism and civic tech bridge effective communication between citizens and government? And finally, manipulations. What are the threats to democracy, the use of technology and tech platforms for information and spreading of fake news and misinformation? And Melissa, I guess you'll help Kathy here. Kathy, I want to begin with you. Tell us a bit more about Quote This Woman, the work that you guys do in amplifying minority voices.
Well, thanks so much. It's great to be here. I've got prepared some slides, so I think Melissa's got them. Perhaps I can ask you to just pull them up on the screen and I'll start talking to them. Thanks. So where are the women? 1 woman for 4 men, and that's if you're lucky. No matter which news media you turn to, global research has shown that on average, the words and the action of women really make the news headlines or news analysis. Next slide, please. That was 2 slides. Thanks. And it's worse in politics, where men are overrepresented and women are underrepresented by a ratio of 7 or 8 to 1. And this doesn't take into account where women do make the news. It's often with gender reinforcing qualifiers of a woman being someone's victim, someone's wife, or someone's mother. Next slide. So what does this mean? that across the globe, news teams consistently amplify the voices, actions, and views of one part of the population at the expense of others. They allow the same old elite to continue to speak the same old language. And that's a problem, because we all know that men and women experience life differently. When women's voices are absent in the news, their realities are not made a matter of record, and the issues that affect them remain invisible. For elections, this means that the difficult questions, and we all know which ones those are, just continue to get ignored. And perhaps they don't even get onto the manifesto. Next slide. So Quote This Woman is a South African-based feminist nonprofit working to close this gender gap by helping journalists find the voices that belong to women, and by training these voices to feel safe in the media or in any spotlight. In fact, not just women. If I can show the next slide. We've got a plus in our name because we are open beyond women to all voices that are marginalized in mainstream news, whether because of living with disability, or because of sexual identity, or gender orientation, poverty, education, rural location, or anything else. Next slide. And Melissa, sorry, if you can just click once. Seems to be text missing, thanks. So how do we bring women experts and journalists together? Actually, in a really low-tech way. We have a database of almost 500 leading women experts that we curate, mainly from Southern Africa, but increasingly from further into Africa. We make it really easy for journalists and newsrooms to access this, so that choosing a woman's voice becomes a no-brainer. There's no charge for experts to be on our database or for journalists to access it. And actually, we started just before the 2019 elections in South Africa as a part of Jamlab, actually. Thanks. Next slide. So this is an example of exactly what Quote This Woman does. It's an example quoting South African political analyst Asanda Ngusheng on Voice of America. And it's done by Anita Powell, a foreign correspondent. And it's an example that I like to use because she shared a conversation she was having with some of her colleagues about us. You can show the next slide. Where you can see that there's a link to the showing her as the source. And just the next slide, please. And a really good shout out for us. Thank you. Thanks, you can go on to the next slide. So if you're a journalist who wants to access the Quote This Woman database, there are two things you need to do. You need to go to our website and click Join Now. Next slide. Fill in your name, email address, and telephone number, and click the option Journalist if you're a journalist, or Student if you're just a journalism student. Next slide. And the second thing is go to newsletter and then sign up for media alerts. We send out a media alert every fortnight, letting you know who to contact, letting you know who the contacts are on our database on trending news topics. Next slide. So how can journalists and civic tech better amplify women's voices in African elections? Next slide. From Quote This Woman's perspective, we believe that the voice that tells the story writes history. This is why the media is called the fourth estate, because journalists must ensure that they access a diversity of voices and narratives, that they do not skew, even unconsciously, which narratives are platformed and which aren't, which versions of history get remembered, and which ones disappear forever, forgotten and unrecorded. In the context of civic tech, the Financial Times in London uses a bot to check the ratio of men to women sources in a story, and won't let that story through if there's no parity. Quote, this woman would love help in getting an open source version of this kind of tech available for the media houses it's building relationships with. And finally, on this point, and we understand the pressures of time and money in newsrooms when we make this call, but please get as many eyes onto your stories before you post, and get those eyes checking the subbing too. A really switched on journalist can have their story ruined by poor subbing or artwork that sends a message that is counter to the story. Next slide. Sorry, one back. One slide back, please. Thank you. Oh, yeah, that's it. Chimamanda Adichie's advice, the voice that tells the story. Are we on the right slide? No, one more, sorry. It should say the danger of a single story. That's it. So remember Chimamanda Adichie's advice, the danger of a single story. Keep your source lists prepared and fire as advanced as you can. Anticipate areas that you'll need experts for so that you can research them, and then reach out to organizations like Quote This Woman so that you can really make sure that you're getting the right sources. And then one last slide, please. And then put in the sweat factor. Remember that there won't be as many women as men for you to interview, and you're going to have to work hard to really get great women to be your sources. And if you can, give them the mentoring and the coaching that they need so that they can become great sources in time. I think I'm going over. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I want to ask you one question. In the context of amplification, why women's voices particularly? In other words, why does Quote This Woman believe that women's voices are so important in African elections?
You know, I think the best way to answer that question is to just understand that when women's voices aren't heard, their stories aren't reflected. And when their stories aren't reflected, history is going to be written in a way that isn't going to tell what really happened. We know that there are women out there whose lived experiences are absolutely critical to changing the way democracy moves forward. And we know that none of this is being reflected in news. None of this is going forward into policy. And this just isn't changing. You know, it's not just in Africa, but across the world, so many countries are unhappy with their governments, and so many countries are still bringing into power governments that they continue to be unhappy with. To a certain extent, there isn't the amplification of the stories and the circumstances that need to be brought to the fore. When women's voices are brought to the fore in news, we know that news is different. It's not necessarily better, but it's different. And that difference is really important.
Absolutely. I want to come on that point. I want to come to Ivan. Uganda had a rather messy election earlier this year, and I'm interested to learn because this is what Kathy has touched on a bit. Let's start by you telling us what you are doing as Digital Women Uganda in helping communities get in line with new technologies, especially those in rural areas, you know, to be able to participate in online spaces as others, you know, especially women and girls in Uganda.
Okay. Sepo, I'm Ivan Pinno. I co-founded.
Sorry.
I'm Ivan Pinno. I co-founded a Civic and a digital rights advocacy organization. We basically looking at women and girls in the rural areas. When you look at their percentage of participation in the online spaces, it's almost not there. And if at all they even get there, they are bullied by the other sex, you see? So we are trying to get a strong inclusion of these women in the online space, and then also help them on how to be safe when they are there. So what we did in Uganda, we've just concluded an election, which was dubbed scientific election. So basically it was run in the online spaces with digital tools and then gadgets, but then the women were not there. Even those in politics couldn't participate. They either don't have the skills to participate or they don't have the monies to buy these gadgets to participate. So we came into this space so that we can actually skill them and also provide them with all they need, the skills and then the gadgets, so that they can be meaningfully participating in this all election. So that is why we actually formed Digital Woman Uganda. So our niche is around women and girls. When it came to the journalists, they didn't have the skills to report their stories on the online platforms. So we trained them, and then also we got their stories to run on different platforms that we are part of, so that these stories can actually be read, and then maybe they could go out and then be seen. So that is what we're actually doing. And then we've innovated so many tools online. Like we have a shortcode which is toll-free. Women can actually interact with us, with different leaders in the online spaces for free of charge. And then we also have an internet radio. We talk to them, but then you should know that these are rural women. So how can they afford internet? Okay, so we have a model around that. It's called a village agent model. So we work with different women groups in the villages. They gather in maybe in groups of 35, and then we can actually install our different equipments, and then churn out the content to them, whatever they want to learn about digital literacy, how they can get on the internet, how they can be safe. Because this model came in handy during the COVID times. We couldn't move, and then we could also gather some people. So with different partners, we've had our content uploaded onto offline devices, and then we've supplied to the women in the rural areas so that they can continue with these tips wherever they are without our physical interaction.
Thanks, Ivan. I want to ask you, can you share some of the skills that you teach the women?
Basically, you know, these are the women can't even send a text message, for instance. You'll be surprised. They cannot, all they know is to receive. You can send them maybe mobile money, but they cannot even withdraw that mobile money off their phones. Worse, they may not even know they've actually received money onto their mobile phone. So these are some of the lessons that we take them through: how to read a message, how to text a message, how to be safe online, how to actually, you know, those small skills, how to save a contact, someone's contact. You see, how to dial. They don't know how to dial a phone number of their mobile phone. So those are some of the lessons that we take them through. And those who are a little bit literate, we actually now, we have internet lessons on how to be safe. Because once women are online, they are harassed. They're either followed, they're bullied, there is body shaming. So we teach them on how to be safe online. So those are some of the lessons that we interact with them.
Ivan, I want to prod a bit more. How do women and minority groups be safe online? What can they do? Practical steps or skills that can somebody implement in that instance?
Okay, for instance, how they can be online, first of all, it starts with them. If at all, let me say they are bullied, they need to talk to each other. So we tell them, if at all you're bullied, ask for help from your friend. Secondly, there are things that you're not supposed to do while you're online. Like you cannot share maybe your nude photos with someone else because it will come back to haunt you, okay? So we tell them on how to actually keep their gadgets safe. They should have a password on their gadgets. So these are small security tips that we actually teach them so that they can actually be safe online. And if at all they are bullied, we actually gave them a platform whereby they can contact us remotely so that we can actually also help them. We have an SMS platform. It is basically, we advise them to send a short code, a text message to our short code in a language that they understand, because most of them don't know English. So we advise them, kindly use the language that you understand, or fall back to our village agent model, who will then get back to us, and then we shall actually give them some support, especially when it comes to the bullies. They are mentally disturbed, basically emotionally. So we take them through counseling, and then on how to be safe, and then to be more safe, and then the next time they're online.
Yeah, before I come to Caroline, Ivan, how are civic tech and communities, especially journalists, are adapting to new tech, especially during elections, during this time of COVID-19 and restrictions?
It was quite tricky for us in Uganda, especially the journalists. Remember, we had an internet shutdown, so basically there was no technology. It was so hard to disseminate this information by the journalists to wherever it was supposed to go. And then also some journalists in the rural areas don't know how to use these platforms. So we empower these journalists, we skill them. And then also we are using their stories, we pick their stories, and then we disseminate their stories through the different channels that we belong to. But most importantly, how we are helping them is we are teaching them on how to tell a story in the digital spaces, because this is not maybe mainstream media. No, these are just platforms that are set up by different organizations. So we group them into groups, and then we teach them on the different technologies that they can use to disseminate their information, and then we get them digitally literate enough to actually use them, because most of them don't know them. And COVID-19 took them by speed. So they are really taking their time, they're trying their time to adapt to these technologies so that they can actually participate in their careers.
Interesting. Thanks, Ivan. And Kathy, yes.
That's so interesting. It sounds like such wonderful work. I'm interested in knowing whether the work you do looks at the whole family, where a cell phone is a family's tool rather than an individual's tool, as in a husband might have a cell phone and a wife might have a cell phone, but rather there's a cell phone that belongs to a household. Would you do work about making sure that there's equal access to that cell phone and equal ability to use it?
Yeah, that was a challenging point for us, especially when we rolled out the model into the refugee settlements. Most refugee homesteads didn't have cell phones. So what we did, we partnered with Radio Talk. It is basically an organization that has a tool. It is a radio that can record content. So that because men are bullies, basically he might have a radio or he might have a phone, but then he cannot use it with the other members. So what we do, we've partnered with these other people to actually give different homesteads these radios or phones. And then we've loaded our content onto these tools and then supply to different homesteads. Secondly, how we've managed that is that through our village agent model, because we work with the villagers themselves, especially the women, they create groups together. And now these groups, we actually supply the equipments that they need so that they can facilitate the training. So the women gather together, and then they can actually listen to the content that we are trying to broadcast or disseminate to them. Because most of them, yeah, it is quite a challenge, and then we are still addressing it. But those are some of the 2 ways that we're actually holding that.
It's really nice.
Very interesting, Ivan, and you know, it speaks to the huge disparity that we see in urban areas and rural areas. Whereas for somebody living in an urban city, they wouldn't even think of that, or that there would be such challenges in 2021. And you ask yourself, where is the government? What are they doing to help? And making sure that people are coming, voices are being heard. And that links really quite well with accountable. Who do we hold accountable? How do we hold government and political leaders accountable? Caroline, I want to come in, and if you can expand more on that, and maybe how should, and also touch on how journalism and civic tech can bridge effective communication, you know, between citizens and government.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my slides. Yeah, some very, very interesting discussions happening here. And, you know, we obviously really take for granted a lot of these elements around who has access to the technology, who has capacity, and then also the issue of motivation to even use the technology for the intended purpose when we're looking at civic tech. So what I wanted to present on is on our project, but let me just start off with an illustration to explain, you know, the importance of accountability. So if you think of, you know, when a citizen is obviously experiencing a problem, they'll go and report it sometimes to a service delivery officer or government, and these will remain as individual reports, sometimes undisclosed, and you don't know what's going on, you know, in relation to progress being made around that issue. Then you have civic action on the other hand, and this will be our civil society organizations, our activists who are trying to gather people together to collectively to address an issue or a challenge that they're experiencing. But the problem is these are separate. So we need to try and merge these together to get those individual voices heard, but also to also support collective action that's taken by our civil society organizations. Now, the idea of, you know, MobiSam, which is the program that I'm running, is to actually bring these voices together on a public platform. We use technology, we use mobile phones, and you have to have the internet. But we also have to take into consideration that civic tech has to be more holistic than that, and where we have to incorporate other views. Some of my slides are timed, but let's see. I'm trying to be within the 5 minutes. So this is an example of the kind of data that's collected on an issue that is experienced in service delivery. And it's just quite a coincidence that in Grahamstown, Makanda now, I don't know if you've been following the news, but there's definitely been an issue. Citizens and residents are just tired, and the taxi association and different activists have come together to protest against the service delivery in Grahamstown. It's been mounting over many years, and now it's kind of escalated to be at really problematic levels. So we have this application that actually is running. It started in 2012, and has been running in various versions and ways up to today. And we still are recording the issues that are emerging. Clearly, water is a main issue because of the old infrastructure and the burst pipes that are continuing, and the water that has been shut many times, followed by sanitation and electricity. So at least now the people who are using this application actually have access to this kind of information that's collated from different individual citizens, whether it's directly through someone who uses the system or through an intermediary who reports on behalf of a citizen. Now, this is just an example of a recent letter that was shared on one of the civil society organizations, Makana Residents Association, on the current situation. We still have the same problems. Even though since 2012 MobiSam started, we still have the very same problems that are emerging. So what's going on? Why aren't people actually making use of data, for its intended purpose? I won't go into too much detail. We also have another project which actually emerged from MobiSam called MobiSafades. And this one is actually implemented in 6 different countries and focuses on access to adolescent sexual reproductive health, because it was becoming a problem in sub-Saharan Africa around the re-emergence of HIV and numbers increasing amongst adolescent youth, and they're taken for granted. So government kept on asking, well, where's the evidence? So we work with Safades, the NGO, who have implemented a program for transforming lives. And at the bottom there, you see social accountability is one of the pillars that they're focusing on, but they wanted that evidence to gather so that they can engage with government at different levels. So it has the same model as MobiSam. We're still collecting data around issues. Person reported is open, so you see orange. And then it's assigned to the relevant individual, so I see it's blue there. And then green, it's been resolved, and red is just been closed by the person who originally reported the issue. So MobiSam is actually working quite more effectively, because you want to see more of the red and green in these kind of diagrams to see that these are actually being addressed. So what is the role of journalists? When we talk about citizen engagement, we have this thing called the citizen ladder, and I'm not sure how many people are very familiar with it, whereby with civic tech, you start off by providing information, move up to participation, and then collaboration and empowerment. Okay, so then in this particular case, most civic tech tends to focus on information and participation, and it tends to end there. what happens after that? How can we lead to more collaboration and empowerment amongst our citizens? And this is where we need our journalists to actually act as facilitators to empower citizens and enable them to see the value in the data that they have access to. So when you're looking at the role of journalism, we're looking at one spectrum is facilitating, and then there's gatekeeping, right? So typically traditional journalism would focus on the gatekeeping element, where it's very much story driven, and it's about, providing residents or citizens with publicly relevant information, but they kind of determine what is publicly relevant. Then on the other spectrum, we look at facilitating, whereby, sorry, I actually clicked on the wrong one, whereby it's more empowering citizens to enable them to see the value of the data that they have access to. And this may be in the form of summarizing key elements of the data, or encouraging citizens to go and access that data themselves in summarized way, or understanding the value that they can get out of that data. So the journalists in this case, you will see in the middle, there's facilitator, experimenter, translator, normalizer. Normalizer is typically what we have for our traditional journalistic role. And then the facilitator on the other spectrum is what we would like to start seeing when our journalists start to use civic tech and data that is being available, so that people can realize that change does happen with the data that is accessible and available to them. Now, in there.
Thank you, Caroline. Really a question directed to your last point there. How do we make sure that journalists are getting the data and can read the data and understand the data to be able to report on it? That's a key thing for me.
Yes, so that's a very good point in question, actually, because first of all, number one, we want journalists to see that there is data that's available, and there are many civic tech programs that are actually coming up, especially in South Africa. I think South Africa is leading in that, as well as East Africa, right? We have the data. What do you need, right? What do you need from us? So this is the data we have available. What do you need? So typically with journalism, it's been story-driven, but what about data-driven? Are you seeing some warning elements that are coming from the data around access to basic services that have not been communicated effectively? And so what do you need? So we are the civic tech specialists. So we are not as good as or specialized as a journalist would be in actually reaching the public. So we would then work with you to generate those key reports that you need, and to develop applications based on your needs. So there needs to be this complementary relationship between journalists and civic technologists around what is relevant and what is needed by the public. On top of that, journalists are also key in pointing us to key data sets that we can access and manipulate and create applications or mobile applications from it to provide journalists with access to information. But again, we're not only focusing on the journalist here. We also want the citizen to sort of be their own kind of journalist in their community, to be able to engage with the data that they have access to, and create stories as well from that, as engaging with other journalists who publish more on it.
Thanks, Caroline. I just want to remind everybody to please do use the Q&A function to ask any questions, and we'll happily bring those into the conversation. Before I get to Daniel, Caroline, one last question. Should civic tech platforms reach out to news organizations when they see sort of trends or warnings from the data they're seeing, since I'm assuming that the creators of these civic tech platforms are the ones who understand and can read the data better than a journalist would?
They should, and they are. They actually are. I mean, if you follow Open Up, I don't know if you know Open Up as an organization. I mean, there's municipal money, and there's another one they're actually working on now, especially around elections. They really want to provide access to journalists around this. And the challenge is to kind of get buy-in from newsrooms, from journalists as well, but also the issue of the skill gap. So if, for instance, Vuleka Mali and the open budget portal, and the data sets available. So they've actually done quite a lot in trying to summarize the data and make it accessible, but to try and analyze and make sense of it, there are still key skills that are non-existent amongst our journalists today. So, you know, there are various programs that can be implemented to train journalists for specific civic tech applications. And they are there, they're trying, you know, it's just about, you know, grabbing interest and buy-in from them to see the value in the data that the data is producing.
Thanks, Caroline. Daniel, I want to come to you quickly in the interest of time. Can you tell us about the work that you do at Ushahidi and how can policymakers leverage civic tech to improve the responses to election disinformation and voter suppression?
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to applaud those who have spoken before me. I mean, Kathy, Ivan, Caroline, it's hard to speak after all the very important points you've made. And I would, before I even introduce myself, I'd just like to highlight something that Kathy mentioned. She said, when women aren't heard, their stories are not reflected. And when their stories are not reflected, history then gets written without the women's voices. I feel that was a very powerful statement. And it just speaks to the groups of marginalized voices out there. And this is really at the heart of what we do at Ushahidi. My name is I'm Director of Implementation at Ushahidi. And it's a pleasure to join this discussion, also share about how we aid marginalized communities to be able to quickly collect and share information that enables them to raise their voices. Change. And I'll just start with a brief historical background of who we are. Ushahidi is a Swahili word that means testimony. And we are a company born out of the post-election violence that broke out in Kenya in 2008 after the general elections. The results were primarily contested, as we see the norm in many countries today. And a lot of what was happening in the ground was underreported or not reported at all. And the founders at Ushahidi created a platform for people to be able to share their firsthand experiences via text, email, SMS, and web. And to date, this platform has enabled, ordinary citizens to be able to document violence in their communities, share information globally, and where possible, even feed into, domestic and international investigations towards accountability for different crimes. And who are we today? We're a global non-profit tech company that aims to provide people with equal access to tech resources that they need to solve problems in their communities and be able to enact social change effectively. We're an open source tech tool that's easy to understand and can easily be used to respond to critical events quickly. The tools, that raise the voices of marginalized groups who tend to be left out of meaningful conversations, help them to be able to better respond. And I'm talking about decision makers now, be able to respond to them, make decisions that are fully representative of the needs of their communities. And the Ushahidi tool has been used more than 160,000 times in more than 160 countries across various categories of social impact, including crisis response, human rights protection, good governance, and relevant to our discussion today would be integrating elections, actually. So when you speak about how policymakers can leverage civic tech to improve their response to election disinformation and voter suppression, I think I'd just like to also resound a reminder to policymakers that they're actually, they're duty bearers to the rights of to the rights holders who are affected by their decisions and actions. And briefly, I can just say, one, there needs to be an increase in participation in electoral processes. There needs to be, broad civic education and voter education. We need to be able to counter misinformation, which is sporadic today. And how can tech work with, support these processes? We can be able to enhance credible and reliable information regarding the electoral and political processes. We can be able to co-create and deploy scalable and data-driven campaigns, both on social media and print, to enable citizens better understand their role and actually rights in the electoral processes. We can also be able to map and improve the feedback loop on knowledge gaps have been identified amongst different groups of people in democratic processes. And yeah, over to you back. And that's brief.
Thanks, Daniel. A question for you: how do we encourage participation in this instance, both from civil society and from the journalists coming to the fore?
So participation, I think about it in two ways. One, by breaking down the silos that exist. I mean, typically, even governments are trying to make sure people participate in elections. But if this information doesn't trickle down to those who need it the most, then, I mean, there's a blocker, and that hinders the participation. But then two, the tools that we develop really need to be low tech. I really liked what Ivan shared before, saying that, their tool is accessible in all forms of ways, one, just even training them how to use, to be able to send a message, being able to use, a feature phone. It's taken for granted that, when people are in low tech communities, throw at them a feature phone, but they don't even know how to dial the keywords on that device. And yeah, these are just two ways which I think we can do. And at Ushahidi, we've been able to, go the extra mile to even work with telcos to make sure that services that social services that are being, accessed through our platform, we can easily integrate and be able to reach them using toll-free platforms. That removes a significant gateway to their access. So yeah, that's just something that I feel can be done.
I want to come to you, Ivan. How do you encourage, especially the women in rural areas, to participate in times of elections and so that their voices can be heard?
For starters, for the women to basically, we've worked with women in different spheres or different areas, especially agriculture. So how we encourage them is that we bring experts, like maybe journalists, and then we bring experts maybe in their fields like agriculture, and then they speak to them about policies, that their voice should be counted if at all they need to be included in the budget. For instance, in Uganda, let me say, basically these are like counselors. It's them that talk to them, and then after they've talked to them, we come in with our tech, and then we deploy it to them. We are like, okay, you're a farmer, fine. You can use this platform to actually sell your product. Okay, so in facilitating them with these platforms and then skilling them and then even giving them maybe a feature phone, we indirectly influence them to participate in the elections. Because at the end of it all, if at all they don't participate in the elections, then different people will actually choose leaders for them. So these people make sure that they speak to them and then make them known that their voices actually count in this election if they want to basically improve their lives in their home states.
Thanks, Ivan. Kathy, I want a link to that, Kathy. I'm interested to understand and how you did it when you started Quote This Woman before the 2019 elections in South Africa, and what are the lessons learned in encouraging women to participate in the media and make their voices heard. What lessons did you learn in 2019 that can still be implemented in 2021?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. When we started Quote This Woman, we were very naive. We thought that our biggest barrier that we were going to, or obstacle, was going to be journalists. We thought journalists absolutely weren't interested in quoting women, and that there were just going to be so many women who were going to flock onto our database. And actually it was the other way around. Journalists by and large were so keen to have access to this resource called the Quote This Woman database. And experts were so reluctant to join our database because of so many factors that we probably don't have time to go into now. And I think that, so there was persistence. It took a lot of one-on-one action, sitting and talking to experts to convince them to take that step to join our database. We've got a very comprehensive Q&A about what it means to be a part of our database. And then we've realized that we've had to commit to media training. So we've got a program called Women Own the Spotlight, where we spend a lot of time working with women experts to make sure that they, well, obviously I'm generalizing because there are, let's not discount the fact that there are many incredible women with very powerful voices who use them really well, but there are many women who just don't like to be in the spotlight and don't like to use their voices and don't like to be interviewed by journalists. So we've done a lot of media training, and we found it's been a ripple effect. What we've found is that once someone is on our database, they've recommended someone else. So 2 years ago, we launched with only 40 names on our database, and now we've got 500 names. So it's grown. It can happen. Yeah.
Absolutely. And Kathy, what you are saying is important. And I'm also interested in our countries on the continent, we have various languages. How do we include those who don't speak English when it's like a second language for many people? Or,
Yeah.
you know, in those instances, how do we include other voices that might not be confident with a colonial language?
Such a good question. So on our database, we ask people what language they are interested in being interviewed in, and we've got that category. So we say, please say what language you'd like to be interviewed in. And we believe that it's important that we have those opportunities for people to be interviewed in whatever language they want to. And that's something that journalists just have to get their head around, that an interview might take longer, and that not every expert is somebody who speaks like they've gone to a private school or a university overseas. Not every expert is somebody who's got a degree. An expert might be somebody who has run an NGO. An expert might be somebody who is an activist in a community and really understands what's happening in a community. And we need huge paradigm shifts in terms of who deserves to have a microphone put in front of them and a spotlight shone onto them and have their voice amplified. And that's why things like databases of experts can make a huge difference. Once somebody is on a database and tagged as an expert, it's amazing how journalists just accept that person. So we believe that Quote This Woman's actually been able to make quite fundamental shifts, not only in terms of who gets interviewed, but also in terms of what issues get platformed. Because what makes the news is as important as who makes the news. What journalists write about is as important around elections as who they interview to write about those issues.
Daniel, I see you nodding a lot to what Kathy is saying. Do you want to come in there?
I think she said it all. And I think it's just important to note that whose voices do actually listen to. And I think that the media plays a big role in determining, setting the agenda really. And I think they need to be more mindful about who they actually place the spotlight on. I think I like what Kathy does, the organization, just trying to identify, especially voices of women who deserve the spotlight. Thank you very much.
Caroline, I want to come to you and then come back to Daniel on this question. A platform like MobiSame, would it be accessible in different languages? For example, if my grandmother is living in the rural areas, she can't speak English, can she access the platform? Can she use it? How do we help her if she can't?
So that's a question that has generally been asked in, well, my field is in ICT for development. It has generally been asked many times in terms of what works best. And you'll find that in some places, people do prefer a platform to be in the language, and in some places they don't. And so the different factors to take into consideration. But the important thing though is also that you should not just rely on technology as the only thing to look to. You know, as when you're looking at a civic tech program, typically, because it's usually the civic tech specialists, your computer scientists and so on that implement these, and they focus on the technology more than anything else. But I mean, you have to think of it holistically. Our project would not work at all if we didn't have certain individuals on the ground, if we didn't have intermediaries, if we didn't have intermediaries, we didn't have ward councillors, we didn't have, and so on and so forth. And you need to actually have these people who actually act on behalf of individuals to report on certain issues that they cannot do so themselves, or, you know, and the idea as well of trying to make it as open as possible to report in a particular language, you know, and make it easily user-friendly in the sense that it's easier to understand what you need to report on when you're reporting on a service delivery issue. So yeah, I wouldn't have an exact answer, yes or no here, because it will definitely vary with different contexts.
Thanks, Caroline. Daniel, Ushahidi is available in 160 countries, you said. Is it available in various languages for those respective countries, or is it still only in English and Swahili?
So Ushahidi is currently available in more than 15 languages. And this is mostly attributed to our community. And being an open source platform, we've opened up our language sets, meaning anyone who speaks any language in the world can translate Ushahidi into their language and be able to use it in their language. So we've opened it up. I think that's just one of the layers to which we've extended access to the people who need the platform.
Absolutely, I like that. And that's linked to what you are doing, Ivan, in Uganda, working with rural women. When you are doing the skills training, are you doing it in a language they understand? When you're doing the radio programs, linked to the question that Sam asked as well, are you linking it to an understandable language for the community, you know, adapting the content to those communities?
I like what Caro had said earlier on. You know, when you're building tools, I've seen so many tools. Innovators build tools without an inclusion of the end users. When we're in Chaka refugee settlement, there is a problem in Chaka. I think it is a digital literacy, and then there's this organization that is sending mobile money to these refugees. But the refugees are not literate enough. They don't even know that they've actually been sent money. So what we did is that we had to first go on ground. We lived with the refugees for 2 weeks to understand firsthand the problem. We realized that they were actually speaking a different Kiswahili. We knew it was Kiswahili, but then when we went on ground, we realized that it is Congolese Kiswahili. It's not even spoken in Uganda. It's not spoken in Kenya. It's not spoken in Tanzania. Now, just imagine if at all we just sat back in Kampala and then built a tool and then deployed it there. It would totally fail. So it is always imperative, very, very strong, for innovators to build tools with an inclusion of the end users. So we built a tool that speaks their language, and it's working perfectly well. Just imagine if at all we hadn't done a field trip, we would have failed them.
Absolutely, and that's what you guys did as well, Kathy, at Quote This Woman. You know, you built a tool. I know when you started on the Jamlab program, I think it was 3 years ago, you wanted to build an app, but then you quickly pivoted to something else. Tell us about that thinking.
Yeah, so when we started, we wanted to build an app because we thought that it was something that would be a really easy interface that experts could use and journalists could use. And we got great advice, in fact, from Jamlab saying, just understand your audience first before you invest in tech. And we probably became the most low-tech program on a media tech project because we understood that we didn't have enough experts buying into us for us to invest in building an app. So yeah, it was a quick pivot, and it was a pivot that saved us. We probably would have gone bang by now if we'd invested in building an app. Yeah. In fact, we only gave up our incredibly low-tech Google spreadsheet about a month ago. So we were incredibly lucky that we didn't go the way of an app. Yeah.
I'm glad that worked, Kathy. And you know, we've got 3 minutes left, and I want to get all of your advice, the panelists, on what is your advice for somebody who's trying to contribute in the space. Let's start with you, Kathy.
Journalist, civic tech. Just be a bit more specific.
Yeah. Whichever you can speak to.
Sure. So I'll just go back to what I said earlier. Whoever tells the story writes history. Never forget that. Yeah. Stick with that.
Caroline? What's your advice for somebody who's trying to contribute in this space? You know, we're heading to elections in my respective country. How do I get into the space? How do I contribute in amplifying other voices during elections?
I think two things. You know, first, looking at the role of the journalists to start looking at what is out there. There's so many answers, too many unanswered questions, especially localized information and localized data. Look a bit more at what's out there and start to promote civic tech a bit more. And then secondly, I also want to speak to not underestimating what our citizens in rural areas can do. I've been working in this area for a long time in rural areas, and it's almost always the case that it's a default that people cannot use certain technologies. And I think people underestimate that quite a lot. So look at opportunities, look at what has worked, and don't focus on what continues to remain a gap forever. Thanks.
Absolutely. Danielle, what should we be doing? How do I contribute to the space? How do I become aware of the threats that are out there while I enter the space?
So I'll start with the basic principle of nothing for us without us. So the only way to be aware about what's actually going on ground for anyone wanting to build tools is to actually go on ground and immerse yourself in the day-to-day lives of people you're building for. I think for me, that's my takeaway. Absolutely.
Ivan, I want to come to you. What is your advice if somebody wants to contribute to the space? What is your advice if somebody wants to implement low tech like you have done in Uganda?
Okay, my advice is that there is a saying in South Africa, I think it's a saying or a word, but it's called Ubuntu. And you realize that COVID-19 has reshaped the way we live, we work, and then we earn monies. But there are societies that we are actually living out as civic tech innovators. How can we innovate with an inclusion of even those marginalized societies in the rural areas? So let us have them inclusive, but all we innovate is, you know, for the rural people, for the rural folks. Let's move away from the towns and let's go deep down with these people.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ivan, for that. Let's move away from the towns and reach other voices that we don't often amplify or put prominent in our media or in our thinking when we design civic tech platforms. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have for today. We've reached the top of the hour. It went by very quickly, and there were still some unanswered questions that I still have, but I hope it's a conversation that we can continue to have on various platforms, on social media, you know, on email. Let's continue the conversation because I feel like there are quite a lot of things that we can still learn as we go ahead into elections, whether this year, next year, or in the future. Thank you so much to our panelists, Kathy, Caroline, Daniel, and Ivan, for all your insights. I've learned a lot, and I hope you as an attendee have learned a lot through this conversation. And without taking too much of everybody's time, before we go our separate ways, I'd like to bring your attention to our fourth and final Jamlab Meetup in collaboration with the Civic Tech Innovation Network. In a couple of weeks' time, we'll be looking at tips and strategies to finance and monetize your civic platforms or your journalism startup in Africa. So do please join us for that conversation taking place on June 24th. The link is in the chat. Do register for that as well. But let's not limit, like I said, our conversations to just webinars. Let's make sure that we implement and we practice some of these things that we've mentioned in this conversation. We will do a write-up with some of these strategies that were shared today, and we'll share that, and hopefully we can spread the knowledge from this session. From myself and the team, thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you in the next couple of weeks when we talk about our next Jamlab topic. From myself and the team, from Civic Tech and Jamlab, it's been a great afternoon. Have a great week further.
Bye-bye.
Bye.